For 500 years, an entire continent called them by the wrong name, and never once bothered to check. Europe called them Gypsies, Egyptians, wanderers from the land of the pharaohs, cursed to roam forever without a homeland. The name stuck so hard it became the only history most people ever learned. There was just one problem. It was never true, not even close. And when scientists finally opened their DNA to find out where these people actually came from, they didn't just correct a 500-year-old mistake. They uncovered a hidden migration so precise, so quiet, and so old that it had survived undetected inside millions of bloodlines, waiting 15 centuries to be read. Today, somewhere between 10 and 12 million Romani people live across Europe, the continent's largest ethnic minority and one of its most misunderstood. They have no single homeland, no national government, no embassy, and yet they've kept a distinct language, distinct music, distinct customs, and a fiercely guarded sense of who is family and who isn't for over 1,000 years, scattered across dozens of countries that never fully accepted them as their own. For centuries, most of Europe didn't even bother asking where they actually came from. The name given to them answered that question, or so everyone assumed. When Romani groups first began appearing across Western Europe in the 1400s, nobody asked them a single, serious question about their origins. Europeans simply looked at their darker complexion, their unfamiliar language, and their nomadic way of life, and guessed. They guessed Egypt. It was exotic, distant, and vaguely fit the picture. The name stuck almost instantly. Egyptian became Gyptian. Gyptian became Gypsy. A word built entirely on a 5-second assumption became the identity an entire continent would use for the next 500 years. The label came with a mythology attached. Wanderers, outsiders, people supposedly cursed to roam without ever settling. That mythology justified centuries of suspicion, expulsion, and outright persecution across European history, including genocide during the Second World War. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Almost nobody for 5 centuries seriously tested whether the Egypt story was even true. It was simply repeated until it hardened into fact, until language, and then DNA, finally forced the question. The first real crack in the Egypt story didn't come from a lab. It came from linguists, over a century ago, who noticed the Romani language shared deep grammatical roots, not with anything in Egypt or North Africa, but with languages spoken in northwestern India. It was a strong clue, but language can travel through trade and contact without anyone's blood traveling with it. The only way to know for certain was to look inside the genome itself. In 2012, a team led by geneticist David Comas, published in the journal Current Biology, did exactly that, sequencing genome-wide DNA from 13 Romani groups scattered across Europe. The result was about as decisive as population genetics ever gets. The ancestors of today's Romani people left northwest India in a single shared migration, approximately 1,500 years ago. Not Egypt, not North Africa, India, and not vaguely, not somewhere in Asia. A specific, traceable corner of the Indian subcontinent, sitting quietly in the DNA of millions of Europeans who had spent 5 centuries being told they came from somewhere else entirely. For a moment, the mystery looked completely solved. It wasn't. Here's where it gets strange. Human DNA carries 2 separate family trees folded into one genome. One passed only from father to son, one passed only from mother to child. And when researchers compared them in Romani populations, the 2 trees didn't agree. The paternal line, the Y chromosome, kept pointing toward populations in southern India. The maternal line, mitochondrial DNA, kept pointing toward the northwest, toward Punjab and Rajasthan, thousands of kilometers away. 2 different parts of the same bloodline, quietly disagreeing about which end of an entire subcontinent the Romani people actually came from. 3 explanations have tried to close this gap. Not one of them has fully won. The first says the Romani were never a single group to begin with. They may have formed from multiple distinct populations already living across India, one lineage from the north, one from the south, that merged into a single community only after they began migrating west together. Under this theory, the mismatch between paternal and maternal DNA isn't a mystery to solve. It's a fossil of a merger that happened before the journey to Europe even began. The second theory points somewhere more specific and more dramatic: military and merchant convoys. Some historians argue the Proto-Romani population may have started as a mixed caste of soldiers, camp followers, entertainers, and metalworkers, assembled from multiple regions of India under shared service to a ruling power, then pushed westward together by war or conquest. If true, the Romani wouldn't just be migrants. They'd be the genetic fingerprint of an army that dissolved into a people. The third theory shifts the mystery away from India entirely and toward the road itself. A genome-wide study in 2019 found the Romani carry substantial Middle Eastern, Caucasus, and Balkan ancestry layered on top of the South Asian core, meaning a significant part of their story wasn't written before they left India. It was written during the centuries-long journey through Persia, the Caucasus, and the Byzantine world, absorbing new bloodlines at nearly every border they crossed on the way to Europe. Different starting point in India. A merger of castes under military service, or a story shaped as much by the road as by the origin. Genetics has confirmed the destination and the rough timeline. It still hasn't fully settled the beginning. What makes the Romani case different from almost every other mystery this show has covered is this: the wrong name didn't just misdescribe them. It was used for centuries to justify excluding them from the very nations they lived in. The DNA doesn't just answer a curiosity about geography. It quietly dismantles a 500-year justification for treating an entire people as permanent outsiders, while at the same time refusing to hand over a single, tidy founding story. The Romani genome is not simple. It's layered, contested, still being mapped population by population. That complexity is, if anything, the most honest possible answer to a question Europe never actually wanted answered in the first place. So where did the Romani people actually come from? The honest answer, after over a century of linguistics and more than a decade of genome sequencing, is Northwest India, without much doubt. But exactly which communities merged in exactly what order and reshaped by exactly how many borders on the way to Europe is a story still being pieced together, one genome at a time. What's no longer in doubt is this: for 500 years, an entire continent built a mythology around a people it never once seriously asked to explain themselves. And the truth was sitting in their blood the entire time, patiently waiting for someone to finally look. A name given in 5 seconds of assumption lasted 5 centuries. A truth carried quietly in human blood took over 1,000 years to be believed. That gap between what we assume about a people and what their DNA actually says isn't just a Romani story. It's the story of almost every group this show has ever covered. The label always arrives first. The truth, when it finally comes, arrives on its own schedule. If a name assumed in 5 seconds can survive 500 years unquestioned, what other stories are we still repeating without ever checking the blood behind them? Subscribe to Blood and History. Every episode, we go back and check.